Megan noticed strange numbers on the screen of her faucet. At first, she thought it was a glitch, but she soon realized someone was warning her of danger. Investigation led to a terrible secret that could destroy all of Chicago. The steel frame of a new skyscraper in downtown Chicago glistened in the morning light as Megan Lawrence, an experienced construction crane operator, slowly climbed the narrow ladder to her cabin. For years, she had worked on high-rises across the country, but it was on this particular project for Summit Innovations that she felt particularly tense. There were rumors among her coworkers about the economy of materials, and Megan herself had noticed inconsistencies in the welds on the steel beams more than once. Sitting in the cramped cabin, she turned on the monitors in a familiar motion. She was to lift a load weighing several tons and carefully place it on the support columns. But a few seconds after the system was started, the screen was suddenly disturbed and a strange message appeared. The text was short, consisting of numbers and letters that changed places every couple of seconds. It immediately flashed a red alert in Megan's mind, the kind of thing she'd only seen in special systems that required complex encryption. She stared intensely at the symbols and made out some of the coordinates before the screen dimmed and returned to normal. She managed to memorize a few numbers: 41.8781 degrees north, 87.6298 degrees west. Those coordinates pointed to a place in the city, but Megan couldn't yet figure out what exactly was there. Can't be a simple glitch, she thought, checking all the cables on the panel. She had to put the load away for a couple minutes to make sure the tech was in working order. In the afternoon, during a short break, she quickly found a map on her phone and entered the coordinates. The point wasn't far from where the construction was finishing up. Curiosity gnawed at Megan, but she realized she didn't have the time or energy to figure it out on her own. So she decided to turn to an old friend, Chris Black, who was head over heels in the digital world. Megan took a few pictures of the screen when that message managed to flash up again and sent him everything she could. That evening, as dusk covered the city and the high-rises were colored by the orange glow of the streetlights, Megan sat in the small coffee shop on Roosevelt Road where they had agreed to meet. Chris was half an hour late, but he looked excited. He tossed his clipboard on the table, rubbed his temples tiredly, and exhaled. "Meg, this isn't just a glitch. There's encrypted information here. I was able to pull the primary code, and I got the feeling that someone had deliberately embedded a software tab into your crane control system." "But why?" Megan frowned. "Does that sound like a threat?" "I can't tell yet, but some of the code hints at a website address or maybe an internal portal. The coordinates are there for a reason. Maybe it's tied to a specific location." Megan nodded, feeling anxiety slowly building inside. She could no longer shrug off the idea that none of this was a coincidence. The next morning, Megan couldn't shake the haunting feeling that someone was watching her. Normally, she would have gotten up with a smile. Climbing to the heights and watching the city from above was her calling. But now she was haunted by the thought of a mysterious message. During a mid-shift smoke break, she overheard two workers, loaders from a subcontracting crew, talking. They were standing behind the containers, loudly discussing how Summit Innovations was saving money on something and that the metal beams were coming in with obvious defects. One of them cursed, saying, "They sent some fake stuff, and our lives are hanging in the balance." Megan stood around the corner, wondering if she should intervene, when she heard the continuation. "These inspectors don't just turn a blind eye, they're obviously being paid," said a thin man with a badge on his helmet. "Otherwise, the construction would have stopped long ago. A couple weeks ago, one of the beams was cracked, but they put it up anyway because there's no time to wait for a new one." Hearing that, Megan felt anger boiling up inside her. All her life, she had prided herself on working honestly and following safety procedures. She had seen construction site tragedies turn into disasters when people were irresponsible to the standards. Deciding she could no longer ignore what was happening, she took a couple pictures of the oddly labeled beams and sent them to Chris, asking him to check with the manufacturer's databases. After work, Megan called Leon Stone, the man who had been her mentor back in the early years. Leon himself had been in the construction business for years and had earned a reputation as a trusted safety consultant. Although he'd recently retired from the business, Megan was sure that if anyone could help her assess the extent of the danger, it was Leon. He arranged to meet her that night at a small bar on the outskirts, away from prying eyes. "Meg, are you sure you're ready to get into this?" he asked, looking into her eyes for a moment. Touching the interests of a large company with ambitious projects is like challenging an entire industry. "I want to see if we're gambling with people's lives for someone else's profit," Megan replied. "If something goes wrong with the beams, it could be tragic. I can't just sit around and wait for it to collapse." Leon nodded. "Okay, I know a couple people among the contractors and the unions. We could set up a sort of informal whistleblower network. But we have to proceed with caution." As Megan walked out of the bar, feeling the snowy wind whipping through her thin jacket, she thought that this was just the beginning. Snow was already covering the streets and cars, and clouds of impending trouble loomed ahead. Chris called her the next morning so early that Megan hadn't had time for breakfast yet. She picked up the phone, feeling anxious. "I found something," he muttered. The coordinates did indeed lead to a facility being built by Summit Innovations. A website associated with construction material suppliers was also registered there. But the best part was that the part of the code I could make out led to a restricted section. I broke through a couple of security barriers and found a list of companies that supply materials to Summit Innovations. "What's wrong with them?" Megan asked, desperately hoping her fears would be in vain. The firms had either had their licenses revoked long ago or were blacklisted for supplying substandard metal and concrete. It turns out that Summit Innovations is working directly with people who have been caught falsifying certificates before. They've had lawsuits, but I don't know how they've managed to keep operating. Megan closed her eyes and tried to realize what all this could mean for the downtown skyscraper. Thousands of people, including her own colleagues, risking their lives. As she thought of the cracked beams, she felt a lump forming in her stomach. "Meg," Chris added quietly, "I found something else. I have a suspicion that someone inside the company is trying to get this information out. The message you received doesn't look like an external hacker attack. It looks more like an internal cry for help." "So I might have an ally at Summit Innovations?" Megan interjected. "Someone who has realized the magnitude of the risk and is trying to warn of the impending disaster?" "Sounds like it." Flustered, but feeling a glimmer of hope, Megan decided to speed up her evidence gathering. She met Leon at one of the warehouses where the materials were stored, and together they took photographs of rusty fasteners and beams with obscure stamps. The warehouse manager almost caught them at that moment, but Megan and Leon, using the cover of a legend that they were checking the compliance of applications, managed to get away with the compromising pictures. That evening, checking against Chris's notes and talking on a secure video link, they made a plan. They decided they needed to find more documentary evidence, contracts, emails, internal reports. Then they could turn everything over to journalists or federal agencies. But to go further, they needed direct access to the Summit Innovations database, and that required security keys. Megan had a sneaking suspicion that the man who'd sent her the coordinates might be able to help, if only she could get in touch with him somehow. It was a harsh winter day. An icy wind whipped through the downtown streets of Chicago, forcing passers-by to bundle up in scarves and hoods. Megan went into her shift, trying to maintain a semblance of a normal work routine, but inwardly she was wary. She found new minor safety violations every day: improperly fastened facade panels, poorly insulated wires, missing bolts in mounting connections. However, her anxiety increased when she noticed an obvious crack in one of the main support beams that she had to lift with a crane. At the risk of angering the shift supervisor, Megan flatly refused to lift the beam until it was checked by an engineer. The supervisor came running in, looking at his watch, and declared that, "We don't have time to play these games." But Megan was adamant. After much bickering, the engineer was called in, and after inspecting the beam, he immediately disallowed its installation, admitting it was defective. The supervisor cursed, then reluctantly agreed to replace the beam, but there was irritation in his voice. "Do you need more than everyone else?" he hissed as he approached Megan. "You think because you're a crane operator you can boss everyone around?" "If I see danger, I have to warn them," Megan replied firmly. "Or are you suggesting I watch this thing fall on someone's head?" The supervisor waved angrily and walked away, while a small group of workers gathered around, many of them quietly looking at each other, clearly in support of Megan. Her resolve only grew stronger. If the company had paid attention to quality, this wouldn't have happened. Toward evening, Chris called back. I managed to get into the restricted part of the website that was associated with Summit Innovations. Found a bunch of emails and documents where management knowingly accepts defective materials. They even have a clear strategy. We can't miss deadlines, otherwise we will lose investors. And we'll solve minor problems later if it ever comes out at all. They literally signed the workers' death warrant? Megan whispered, looking at the gradually darkening sky outside the panoramic glass of her cab. Looks like it. I've already sent some of this good stuff to a reporter from the local paper. But we need proof of bribes to the inspectors. Without that, they'll say it's a local problem, not a systemic one. Okay, I'll try to get more, Megan replied. By the way, I've noticed that I've been getting a lot of stares from people in the office today. It's like they know I'm snooping around. Be careful, Chris warned. And don't tell anyone you have proof. I'm sure they'll try to clean it up if they suspect a leak. That same night, Megan received an anonymous message on her phone. I know you're aware. Keep it up. Time is limited. Reliable contact is 1979 Larkin. It sounded like this was the same person inside the company who was helping from the shadows. But how to contact him? Was this an offer of a meeting? Or a code to their internal portal? Megan decided to forward the message to Chris, asking him to decipher it. Her intuition told her things were moving toward a denouement faster than she expected. The days in Chicago were getting colder, and the construction site was in a feverish rush. The deadline was fast approaching, and Summit Innovations was making sure the workers were working non-stop. Megan could barely keep her eyes on safety. Tensions were rising, and strange things began to happen around her. Tools on the crane were out of place. Alarms were malfunctioning. Chris, meanwhile, reported that the anonymous contact, signed as 1979 Larkin, was probably a technical engineer from the central office who had been trying to get through to management for some time. He provided them with an array of correspondence that clearly showed a cover-up of rebar and concrete problems. Chris summarized the material into one large dossier and gave it to a reporter working for a federal news agency. The story was due out next week, unless something unforeseen happened, and it did. One evening, as Megan was about to finish her shift, a panicked evacuation message came over the service channel. It turned out that a threatening crack had been discovered in the center of the 60th floor ceiling. Workers could hear the crunching and grinding of metal. The shift supervisors shouted that everything was under control, but fear among the crew spread faster than orders from above. Megan got the message, "We need to get people out now." She didn't wait for orders from the office and, leaving her crane behind, ran down the floors shouting into a horn, "Everyone downstairs now. Take only the essentials, no tools or materials." Despite the wind gusts and winter cold, she managed to organize a group descent down the emergency ladders. The building structure shook slightly, and people looked on in horror at the cracks in the beams and floor slab. A few people began to panic, but Megan used all her experience to urge them to remain calm. At this time, Chris received a warning from 1979 Larkin. One of the key support columns had been assembled from substandard metal, and it was already warping under the weight of the upper floors. If the structure was not urgently reinforced, part of the skyscraper could collapse. But it was too late. The distribution of loads and internal defects had done their job. When the last worker came to a safe distance, where ambulances and firemen were standing, there was a rumbling crack. Like a giant stage set, part of the upper floors suddenly tilted. Facade panels were torn off by the wind and fell from the height, crashing to the pavement. The sound of tearing metal rang through the air. Megan felt the ground shake beneath her feet. The tower began to collapse from top to bottom, floor by floor, and dust kicked up to the sky. The sirens of ambulances and firefighters cut her ears non-stop. In the commotion, she saw Leon, who was helping to transport the injured to the side, and ran up to him, her whole look of horror. "We were able to get most of the workers out," he shouted through the noise. Hundreds of casualties were avoided, but a few people were still hurt. Chris, who had gotten to them, added, The reporter has already gotten the story about the corruption and kickbacks. Now Summit Innovations won't have a chance to hide. A collapse like this will not be silenced. Megan stood in the midst of the chaos, with soot on her face and blood seeping through the torn sleeve of her jacket. But she was alive. Hundreds of shards of glass and concrete were lying around, and fine snow continued to fall from the sky, mixing with the dust. The next day, every channel was reporting on the construction disaster and the high-profile scandal surrounding Summit Innovations. Investigators and journalists took up the cause. Internal documents were leaked to the media, causing a bombshell effect. It turned out that the company had been bribing inspectors for years and deliberately turning a blind eye to defects. A week later, Megan was released from the hospital with a bandage on her shoulder and a couple of stitches under her knee. But much deeper were the moral wounds from the realization that only by a miracle had been avoided mass loss of life. After gathering her courage, she announced that she intended to found an independent initiative to monitor the safety of construction projects. Leon and Chris supported her idea, and the anonymous engineer from Summit Innovations who had revealed the truth to them agreed to help as an expert. "Hopefully this case will be a lesson to the entire industry," Leon said, looking at Megan. They were standing in a vacant lot where the debris from the collapsed tower had recently been removed. "And a great cautionary tale for other companies. And we'll do everything we can to make sure that tragedy doesn't happen again," Megan replied. There was pain and determination in her voice. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. But once she had survived the horror, she was not going to stop.